If you have colleagues that are joining and running late, all of this will be recorded and people can look back at it as needed. So we will go ahead and get started. Welcome. We're going to talk about the Fidelity of Implementation tools and resources related to the Stronger Connections grant. So some norms as we jump in. This webinar will be recorded and posted to the TEA's Stronger Connections webpage after today's webinar. And then the slide deck will also be available, as well as the Fidelity of Implementation toolkit that we'll look at and discuss throughout this webinar. As far as questions are concerned, please try and use the Q&A feature. Please try and use the Q&A feature so that we can export all of those and include them into the FAQ section in the FOI toolkit. Our co-hosts and panelists, Hank and Carol, will be monitoring those. And then at the end of this presentation, they'll voice over some, popular questions that were submitted or important questions that were submitted. But as things come up, feel free to just pop it in there and they'll answer that for you guys. So this is our Stronger Connections team. Our director, Hank, is on. I'll let him say hi really quickly and we'll get going.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for the Fidelity of Implementation webinar so that we can help you better understand how to use this tool to keep your project on track and to get the support that you need. I'm going to go ahead and hand this back to Sarah to get going on it.
I am the Stronger Connections grant specialist, but we are very, very lucky to have some folks from the EDRS team within TEA that's supporting this project as well. So Tanisha, Paige, and Derek are also working on Stronger Connections, all things case management, FOI support as well, really wherever data is interwoven into this project, they're there with us. And then we have additional TEA support, our division director, Dr. Amy Blakely, and then Julie Wayman and Bobby Lehman as well. And then, of course, the Texas Center for Student Supports over in Region 16 Amarillo has been very crucial to all of this work. And we are lucky to be able to work alongside them on this project. So there are three main objectives for this webinar. And we'll have an exit ticket at the end that will reflect these. But we're hoping at the end of this hour, which heads up is chock full, tons of information, that you at a minimum can walk away with a good understanding of the purpose of the Fidelity of Implementation tools, the FOI check-in process that will be hosted with your regional ESC leads, and then next steps for this upcoming Q1 submission of the Fidelity of Implementation tool and survey. So we'll walk through the purpose of the FOI. We'll go over the 6 performance measures. Those performance measures were previewed back in November during the SCG kickoff webinar. But we've built those out a little bit more and are excited to share those with you all. Then we will open up the actual toolkit where you can find the performance measures and the rubric criteria, and we'll look at that. We will preview the Smart Sheet survey, which acts as essentially the mechanism to get your FOI evaluation data to the agency. And then we will talk about the check-in process with your regional ESCs. There's a couple of notes we want to make on quality assurance. So really just encouraging you that this tool is meaningful. And then we'll look at resources that will be made available later this week. Again, that timeline and next steps as we approach this first Q1 submission of the FOI. And then at the end, Hank and Carol will voice over any FAQs that popped into the Q&A feature. So why the FOI? We are, from the TEA side, very familiar from a district perspective on how data reporting can seem much more like checking a box, and an administrative burden. And so when we thought about the evaluative process with the Stronger Connections grant, we wanted to make sure that the tool was very meaningful, purposeful, and at the end of the day, provided you guys with a dedicated time and space to evaluate how you're doing, celebrate the strengths, try and replicate those and scale them statewide. But then also just have opportunities to be open and honest about the challenges, the barriers, and figure out what kind of in-time supports you all need to show progress within the performance measures that might be that you might be struggling with. And so the tool itself is not compliance driven in the sense that none of this is tied to funding. So later we'll look at that rubric criteria, and you'll notice that districts will rate a 1, 2, 3, or 4 in different performance measures. If the district is rating 1s and 2s, that's not tied to funding in any way. Again, it just provides a chance to look at where you are, find those in-time supports, and figure out how we can kind of move up on that 1, 2, 3, 4 scale to make sure that we're meeting grant goals and deliverables and objectives. So on that note, we do have program assurances within the Stronger Connections grant that you guys will provide timely response to requests from TEA as it pertains to data on program development and implementation. So this is a requirement of the Stronger Connections grant, both the use of the FOI toolkit and the check-in process with your regional ESCs. But everybody on this team is very hopeful that by the end of this, we'll have an understanding and we'll be able to convince and assure you again that this is not for the purpose of checking a box and calling it a day, but more so giving you guys the tools that you need to figure out where you are and where you want to go. So we will jump right into the performance measures, but I want to preface it with a couple of questions that I think might come up as you guys are listening. So again, each performance measure has rubric criteria on a 1, 2, 3, 4 scale. If you are looking at the criteria and you find that you are in between scores, we want above all else for the rubric to exist to provide you guys with a great tool to facilitate progress monitoring. So at the end of the day, your leadership team should use their best professional judgment when it comes to selecting a score. Most of the time, since the rubric criteria is very much checklist, you should be able to figure out where you fall. But again, it's up to you guys. And if you're the ones locally having those conversations, then you should be the decision makers when it comes to what your rating will end up being. The same thing for if criteria doesn't apply. When you're rating these first couple of quarters versus when you're using the rubric to rate much later in this grant cycle, it's going to look a lot different and ratings will fluctuate because it just matches the nature of this work. And so when you are looking at rubric criteria, be mindful of where you are in this grant process, because again, rating this first quarter is going to look a lot different than, a year from now. So if the rubric criteria does not yet apply to all participants, then you'll just omit it. And so to clarify, if it doesn't apply to you specifically, then that means that you haven't done it yet. And so you'll be mindful of that when you're choosing your rating. But if it doesn't apply to everyone across the board, then it's just not up for consideration at that time. So a good example of that is eventually we will be implementing a case management system. The rollout for that has not happened yet. So if your rubric criteria says that all of your staff have been trained on the case management system, you'll omit that from this first quarter rating because that just doesn't apply. And then the last FAQ to mention before we dive into the performance measures is what if I have a low rating? Again, your narrative responses and your check-in conversations with your ESC leads are held in a much higher regard than just your numeric score. So at the end of the day, we have to collect that quantitative data piece because that's what's going to allow us to map it, analyze it, and find trends statewide. But that can sometimes discredit the qualitative data that you guys are collecting as well. So low scores indicate areas of growth and should be followed up with in-time supports and conversations with your ESC leads, the TCSS, and to the extent to which it applies, TEA as well. But low ratings indicate opportunities for growth, and we want to make sure that everybody views it that way going into this process. So performance measure 1, and I'm going to go a little bit quickly through these, but again, everybody will have access to this slide deck this week. Performance measure 1 is grant management, and we want to make sure that awardees are on track to spend 100% of their funds in accordance to grant goals and deliverables. We want to successfully connect dollars to the work of the grant. We don't want to find ourselves in a position where it is January of 2026 and we have $500,000 to spend and no idea what to spend it on. So we're just kind of willy-nilly picking things for the sake of drawdowns. We want to provide you guys with the tools and resources to successfully connect the dollars to the work that you guys are doing. And then, of course, we do want to comply with state and federal reporting requirements. So some of those variables are integrated into this performance measure as well. So in a minute, when we look at the FOI toolkit, you'll see a rubric that corresponds to each performance measure. I've put the meets expectation criteria on each of these slides. Of course, the 1 and the 2 and the 4 criteria will look a little bit different. But I think this is the best way for the sake of this, this hour to kind of look at the criteria itself. So in order for a district to have met expectation on performance measure 1, we want to make sure that quarterly budget proposals are submitted for this upcoming school year and eventually for the 25-26 school year as well. We want to make sure that the LEA is on track to spend a certain percentage of funds by certain dates within the grant. Of course, there's some flexibility built in there because this work, is not as streamlined as we may think. We want the LEA to continuously create an environment where local stakeholders can participate in those budget discussions. We don't want the work of the grant to live over here and the dollars to live someplace else. We want to bridge the gap between those entities. And then we want the district or awardee to be able to justify all of their expenses against the deliverables and goals of the grant. And then we want to maintain quarterly, if not monthly, drawdowns and budget expectations, again, so that we can make sure that we're on track and pivot if we're not. Performance measure 2 is training and professional development. This performance measure makes sure that the awardee is building capacity and utilizing the right technical assistance providers, namely the TCSS and regional ESCs, and then potentially any other third-party vendors that the district might have a partnership with. So meeting expectation here means that the awardee is up to date on all TCSS trainings, that the appropriate staff have attended and completed those trainings, that the LEA is providing timely feedback to TCSS and their partners regarding that training and professional development experience. That way we can provide them with the feedback they need to pivot and go a different direction as needed to best serve you guys. And that you guys are participating in any additional training and professional development that aligns to your goals and identified needs that were stated in the application. So essentially, again, if you're working with that third-party provider for certain areas of training and professional development, that you're meeting those deadlines as well. And then this last one won't apply to everybody, but if the LEA is working with a non-approved vendor through the appeals process, if you're unfamiliar with that, it has been posted to TCSS's website, so you can go and check it out. Then the LEA needs to make sure that they've submitted all the required documentation to TCSS in full and on time, again, to be in that meets expectation category of this performance measure. The next one is data collection, so making sure that the awardee is submitting those critical data entries using the tools and timelines set forth by the TCSS. And then it also measures the ability to identify in-time supports and turn around the data that you guys are collecting into actionable next steps. So this would look like a district ensuring that all staff have completed the necessary training pertaining to the case management system, that the district has ensured all campus and district leadership understand the case management system and support its staff in that CMS use, that the district meets the case management system data entry timelines, It also incorporates these mandatory FOI check-ins. So to be under meets expectation, the district attends all of the quarterly FOI check-ins and submits the corresponding Smart Sheet survey that we'll talk about later. And then we also want to use this as an opportunity to tie in our local advisory committees. And so in order to meet expectation here, post submission of each quarterly FOI, we want advisory committees to have a chance to debrief, really just because it'll provide a streamlined tool to use in your advisory committee meetings to talk about what's working, what's not working, and any input that they might have. And then participating campuses have completed the appropriate climate surveys according to TCS timelines, and then any other data, including critical feedback data as requested throughout this grant process. On that note, it is nobody's intent to keep throwing survey and data collection metrics at you guys through this grant cycle. But anytime we need to tweak something that's already in existence, making sure that you guys are meeting those submissions as well. Performance measure 4 is all about the student support framework. And this is also encompassing of parent and family engagement, advisory committees, and student support teams as well. So to meet expectation, the district leadership understands the student support framework and parent and family engagement playbook and supports the implementation. The district has ensured that all staff have completed the necessary trainings as it relates to the student support framework, student support teams, parent and family engagement. And then any evaluation and diagnostic materials developed by TCSS are completed and incorporated into next steps and action items at the local level. We also want to make sure that the district is on track to establish their local advisory committees. This is really going to be a heavy piece that you'll be evaluating in this first quarter because while we're in a planning phase, a lot of the performance measures we're discussing today don't apply just yet. And then the last one is making sure that staff at participating Stronger Connections Grant campuses have regular opportunities to ask questions, problem solve, and debrief regarding their experiences when we think about implementation of the student support framework and student support teams. Okay. Performance measure 5 is SMART goals and benchmarks. So as you may recall, when your district was applying for this grant, there were 3 identified needs and corresponding SMART goals and benchmarks that were in the application. Some of those may have also been adjusted during program negotiations. But this is in place to make sure, again, that districts just have a dedicated time and space to always look back and think, what were our original goals, what we wanted to accomplish, and are we moving towards the accomplishment of those goals? There is flexibility built in, but we just, again, wanted to make sure that this was integrated when we think about evaluation of this grant. So to meet expectation, districts and campus leadership, as well as the teachers at participating campuses, should understand those goals and benchmarks. And again, this goes back to a lot of times during the grant application phase and the budgeting phase, there's a certain group of people that are working towards this. And again, not all the time are campus leadership and teachers involved in that. And so at this point, now that SMART goals have been solidified, we want to make sure that your 1 to 3 campuses participating in this grant understand what everybody is working towards. We also want to make sure that the goals developed by the district have an adequate data source connected to it. So that way you can effectively measure the progress that you guys will be seeing. We want to make sure that goals and any corresponding data are discussed quarterly. It would be fantastic and I think natural in a lot of sense to discuss this more frequently than a quarterly basis, but the FOI was established quarterly so that there is enough time for you guys, again, to dedicate some time and space to talk about your SMART goal progress. And then these last 2 couple of metrics, we want to make sure that local advisory committees are given timely opportunities to review progress on the goals. And then we want to make sure that goals are on track. And if they are off track, we want to identify next steps, interventions, and end-time supports to discuss with relevant stakeholders so that, again, we can see that progress as we continue to move through the grant cycle. Then the last performance measure is sustainability. And really, this looks like the awardee integrating sustainability measures into your programmatic decisions. We understand that this is oftentimes the most troublesome part of a grant because the money is here and then the money is not. And a lot of that is out of our control, and we always are making decisions based on the what ifs of if there's more funding, if there's an extension, that sort of thing. But we want to make sure that locally we're also providing you guys with resources and opportunities to talk about what can we do for sure to extend the work that we're accomplishing in the next 2.5 years. And so to meet expectation here, we're really just giving you prompts to discuss. And so district leadership, campus leadership, teachers, members of the student support teams are meeting regularly to discuss grant progress. Local advisory committees are also giving opportunities to discuss when we think about sustainability, and really just rooting those conversations in current challenges. How can we move forward, move past them? Maybe even anticipated challenges that we can prepare for now. Recent success, so what's working and how can we scale it? How can we sustain it? And then maybe areas of the budget that could be reworked to ensure longevity. And then each time you're evaluating the sustainability piece, we're going to ask you to document 2 questions. So what's one avenue of your work that demonstrates scalability to other campuses? Again, if that applies to you. And then what's one avenue of your work that demonstrates sustainability beyond September 30th of 2026? And this obviously will look a lot different during a Q1 evaluation versus a year 2 evaluation. And we recognize that. Okay.
Sarah, before you move on, we did have a question come in when you were talking about the performance measures. The performance measure regarding the district's 3 goals that were in the application. The question was, if a district wants to change their goals, do they have to amend their application, or can they just make the change on the FOI?
So there has already been a couple of districts under new leadership, or just as more information comes in about this grant, that have used the program negotiation stage to update or change their goals. Yes, an amendment would need to take place so that program staff at the TEA level also understand the change in goals and can make sure that that's in alignment with grant goals and deliverables. And so that we can reach out to your regional ESC and to the TCSS to make sure that there's been an update, as they'll have everybody's goals documented so that they can begin to identify trends and tailor supports. So yes, I would reach out. If you know now that there's going to be an adjustment, I would certainly reach out to me now so that we can get jump started on this progress or on that process. But just know, again, flexibility is key in this work. There are a lot of different things that districts are juggling, a lot of different changes that happen that are outside of our control. So if a change in your SMART goal pops up at any point, just reach out to program staff at TEA so that we can provide you with those next steps. Anything else since we just wrapped up performance measures before I display the toolkit?
There are no other questions in the Q&A.
Okay, great. As questions are coming up, feel free to hold them to the end. I think we'll have about 10 minutes or so if you want to wait and see if it's answered prior to that. Or as soon as it hits your brain, feel free to dump it in the Q&A. We'll get you an answer as soon as we can, and we might voice it over too so that others can be aware. I'm going to stop sharing briefly so that I can show everybody the toolkit. Okay. So the performance measures and the corresponding rubric criteria has been elaborated much more in depth than what we saw on those 6 slide decks or slides on the slide deck. And so we've put together a Fidelity of Implementation toolkit that you guys can reference throughout this grant cycle. It's structured with an intro to the Fidelity of Implementation tool itself. And I believe for the most part, everybody on this call, or if not your counterparts, have received this first page as a FOI one-pager. So essentially, it just names the 6 performance measures. It talks about briefly the evaluation steps when we think about the check-in process. And then it has that compliance note over here that hopefully is a weight off your shoulders when we think about, again, just what this FOI is rooted in. Beyond that, each page is structured the exact same. So it'll tell you what performance measure you're looking at. It'll give you an overview of that performance measure. It'll give you a series of guiding questions to help jumpstart the conversation. And then over here on the right side of the screen, it gives ideas. This is not prescriptive and this list is not exhaustive. But it does give some ideas of example artifacts that should be maintained locally that correspond to each of these performance measures. I'm going to go a little bit more in depth on that here in a couple of slides. But the main thing is it also outlines your rubric criteria. So again, we have to have that quantitative piece. So we've structured this as an opportunity for you guys to rate a 1, 2, 3, or 4. In the slide deck, we voiced over what a meets expectation criteria might look like. It functions as a checklist, so you can go down, boom, 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 to figure out where on this scale you are. If you find yourself in a position where you cannot tell if you are a 2 or a 3 or a 3 or a 4, again, use your best professional judgment. This tool serves you, not the agency. And so we want to make sure first and foremost, that you have the confidence to again, just use your best professional judgment. And that's how each of the performance measures are structured. Then at the bottom, I will try to not scroll super fast. There is a frequently asked questions section. All of the Q&As that we had from the February 29th FOI webinar plus today's webinar will be captured in this FAQ. We already have some that were back from the kickoff webinar. We have some that we anticipated, some from ESCs. So we're going to make sure that any of those questions that are coming up are always put here. And then it's just broken out into 5 sections. So questions regarding the purpose of this tool, questions regarding the logistics of this FOI tool, questions regarding the 6 performance measures, questions that have to do with deadlines. So of course, we will update this section of the FAQ prior to each quarterly submission. And then questions about the structure of the check-in process itself. And then again, we'll talk about a lot of these items here in the next few slides. The slide deck will be posted. We will make sure that there are plenty of avenues for you guys to have access to these questions so that you can feel confident moving into the FOI process. But that's what the toolkit looks like. I again have to stop sharing, share a different screen. But I wanted to look at the corresponding submission survey. Oh, my apologies. We need to be over here. Okay, so you will have a copy of that FOI toolkit, whether you maintain it as a paper copy, whether you maintain it as a digital copy, and that will follow you throughout the grant process. But again, when we think about the best way to get information from your FOI rubric ratings to the TEA and to the various stakeholders working with us, we felt the best way to capture that information was through a corresponding FOI submission survey. So each time your teams are working locally to go through the rubric, have those great discussions, come to terms with your ratings for each of the 6 performance measures, one representative from your team will then be responsible for putting that information here in the Smartsheet survey. So very quickly, we will scroll through this so that you guys know exactly what to anticipate for this first quarter. The top will always be your awardee information. So we want to know who's completing the form. You'll have an ESC region, which will prompt your selection for which LEA you are. And then there'll always be a question for any changes in point of contact, because we know that that's often the nature of the game. So just another touch point for us to figure out who the best person to talk to is moving forward. And then the next section, this will only appear on the first submission of the FOI survey. We really want to make sure that your regional ESC leads and the folks at the Texas Center for Student Supports have access to your SMART goals from your application. Again, so that they can start to identify trends, and start, again, just building a more thorough database for support for you guys. And so you will copy and paste your application SMART goal into this box. We'll make sure that regional ESCs and the TCSS have access to it, so that they can dig in and be familiar with what you guys are working towards. After that, the performance measure sections look the same. So it's 4 questions per performance measure. We want to know your rating. So you'll click 1, 2, 3, or 4. If you select a 1 or a 2, it will prompt you to type in what supports you guys need to help you show progress. That could be local supports, regional supports, what you need from the TCSS, or what you need from TEA. If you select a 3 or a 4, it will ask you to certify that you have artifacts maintained locally, that TEA could view during one of your quarterly check-ins. There's no place on this form for you to pull all of these artifacts and submit them. That is just unrealistic. But for the efficacy of this whole FOI process, we do want to make sure that the documentation you guys are keeping locally anyways, when we think about advisory committee minutes or any data tools that you guys have, or any partnerships that you have with external vendors, or attendance records for which staff have been trained and which staff have not. We want to make sure that you guys understand you do need to keep that locally, so that during a virtual check-in, there is an opportunity for TEA to take a look at those artifacts as it pertains to the conversations we have during those check-ins. Past that, everybody will be responsible for entering a narrative response. So again, quantitative data is important, but the story behind those numbers is more important. So in 4 to 6 sentences, you will talk about, essentially at a high level, what your leadership teams discussed when you were talking about performance measures 1, 2, 3, and so on. So this doesn't really function as a space to just like regurgitate that checklist information that's within the rubric criteria, but more so, again, just a high level summary of the conversations you guys had. That way, when you guys have your virtual check-in with your ESCs, this will be a great tool to reference and say, oh yeah, we talked about, A, B, and C as it pertains to each of these performance measures. And then this functions the same for the remaining 5 performance measures. And then at the very end, there will always be a section on budget-related questions. Given we're still in the planning phase, our budget-related questions for this FOI submission look a lot different than what they will in the next couple of FOI check-ins. So these budget-related questions have to do with vendor assistance, again, outside of your regional ESC and outside of the TCSS. We do ask if there have been any expenditures to date. We recognize that that probably won't apply to most, given all NOGAs have not been sent. And depending on local policy, there might not have been funds expended up until this point. In addition to, we don't really anticipate, with being in a planning phase, many funds to have been drawn down until we get closer to this summer. But if that does apply, you'll follow the prompts there. And then the last one is really important, and this will be an action item that we talk about later in this presentation. But there is an expectation for districts to work with their business office to create a proposed quarterly budget prior to the start of each school year. So this asks, hey, have you already done that? Yes, great. If not, we just prompt you with a message that says, in the June FOI check-in, this will be an expectation. So if you haven't already set aside some time on the calendar to chat with whoever the business manager might be, and we recognize a lot of you probably wear those same hats, But if you haven't scheduled time to do so, make sure that that's prioritized over the next couple of months. Because we will, for federal reporting purposes, ask you for your proposed quarterly budgets, again, prior to each school year. So that's what this submission survey looks like. And again, the performance measure content will remain the same. Your budget related questions will change throughout the grant cycle, just depending on, you know, kind of what semester we're in and so on and so forth.
We
So
did have a
I will jump.
question real quick on
Yep.
the survey. Somebody asked in the Q&A, if there's an area, you said earlier that they could omit a question if they haven't addressed that yet. Their question was, how do they do that on that survey? Because it looked like there were a lot of required items with the asterisks.
Sure. So a rating is always required. But what that means is when you're using the rubric criteria, the performance measure itself will always apply because there's always rubric criteria integrated that talk about what goes on in the planning phase versus what goes on in the implementation phase. And so while there may be rubric criteria that specifically doesn't apply to this, you know, timestamp in the grant cycle, there will be other criteria that do apply. So at no point will one whole performance measure not apply entirely. And if you have more questions about that, that's actually fantastic. I'll put that in an FAQ. Hopefully I articulated that okay. If there's some confusion around that, let me know. But again, you'll always rate on all 6 performance measures because we've made sure that the rubric criteria, again, contains information that applies to both the planning phase and the implementation phase. So in this case, you would omit anything that applies to the implementation phase because we're just not quite there. I think the answer to that question will also make a lot more sense when the rubric criteria is right in front of you. And we understand that that's not available just yet, but it will be available this week. And so I think it'll be a little bit easier to process that answer when you're looking at the checklist criteria. Any other questions, Hank or Carol, about the toolkit or survey before I talk about timelines and the check-in process?
There's one about the link for the survey. Will that be emailed to the point of contact?
Yes. So, so prior to every check-in, we'll make sure that you have a brief communication from myself, letting you know, hey, this is the window, it's open. Here's, you know, the link to the TEA webpage where you can download your toolkit. Here's the link to the submission survey. I imagine that ESC leads will also be communicating that to you as well. Again, not to, you know, burden you down with 1,005 emails, but prior to each quarter, we'll make sure that you have that easily accessible. And then we'll also have the survey link live in the toolkit. So when you go to the TEA SCG webpage and download the toolkit, we'll have it hyperlinked to that submission survey so that you guys have access to it. Great. Okay. So we will keep rocking and rolling. Again, I know that this is a lot of information, but you will have access to all of these resources, and I am also at your disposal. So please feel free to reach out whenever you need for clarification. Okay, so the check-in process itself. Awardees will, we're just going to go kind of start to finish of the check-in process. So SCG awardee leadership, so this could be campus leadership, district leadership, the business office. It might be folks from your student support teams, really just relevant stakeholders. Will meet locally to review that FOI toolkit and rate. So you'll download it. You will spend probably about an hour, maybe a little bit more, going through each of the performance measures as that combined team. And figuring out where you are at that point in time of the grant. Remembering that if you're 1s and 2s, that means that you've got 2.5 years, right, to be able to get to the end and reflect back and see that growth. So nobody panic. But you guys will meet as teams locally, go through the review process. You may print out copies of the rubric. We would recommend maintaining a digital copy where you can highlight your rating. You can leave comments within that document to look back on. That way it's living and everybody has access to it. After your teams have agreed upon those ratings, then one representative, maybe an administrator, a project director, somebody who has assumed more of like a, umbrella role of project implementation, will actually go in and fill out that FOI submission survey. There's a box at the end of the survey that says, click here if you want a copy of your responses. Please click there so that you can have a copy of your responses. We're more than happy to pull those for you at any point in time. But that will be very useful when we think about sharing information with advisory committees, sharing information with your ESC regional leads, and just sharing information with stakeholders, and having access to it, a year from now to look back on. Once you have met locally, one representative has submitted that FOI survey to us at TEA, then your ESC Stronger Connections Grant point of contact will reach out and schedule with you a check-in debrief virtual call. And really all your ESC Stronger Connections Grant leads are doing is facilitating a conversation with you guys to talk about strengths, talk about weaknesses, and be able to talk about end-time supports as well. ESC leads don't contribute to your ratings. ESC leads we know are not regulatory. That's why we're here. We anticipate those discussions being about 45 minutes. We know, especially right in this season, that there's a lot going on. So work with your ESC to figure out that virtual check-in, what kind of time and space you need to be able to tackle that. But do remember that it is a requirement in conjunction with the actual survey that you guys are submitting. EA's Stronger Connections program team. So myself, Hank, any of our data folks that are not, in view right now on the call, will aim to attend at least one of your quarterly check-ins per grant year. This semester, we're in a planning phase, so we do plan on popping in to a handful of check-ins because we are 2 steps removed from the work. And we want to make sure that we understand what you guys are experiencing. And we just kind of want to maintain that bird's eye view of what's going on. So again, when we're thinking about like the upcoming 24-25 school year, there will be 98 of you guys that are having these virtual calls. You should expect to see somebody from the TEA team on at least one of your quarterly calls when we think about the 24-25 school year, and then again in the 25-26 school year. Yeah, okay. And then again, just another note, FOI submissions and these check-ins are required. I've also given us kind of a visual start to finish of what this check-in process looks like. And if you're good to go, fantastic. If it's still a little unclear, then remember you can always refer back to this deck and kind of think, oh, I'm right here in the check-in process. This is what I should expect to come next. So again, your awardee teams will meet locally. You're going to use that FOI toolkit to rate. I recommend doing that digitally so that you can always have access to it. Once you guys have determined your 6 performance measure ratings, one person is responsible for submitting that Smartsheet survey. After that's been submitted, your ESC lead will reach out to you to schedule that check-in. TEA may or may not join. It will be a surprise, but it is not meant to be a gotcha. It is more so for our sake than it is for yours. Again, we're far removed, as I'm sure everybody on here knows. And we just want to make sure that we're there to serve you and that we never lose sight, right, of what's really going on in our awardee campuses. After that meeting takes place, We would hope that there is a conversation right away in that meeting where we're talking about the support and next steps and follow-up that ESC leads can provide you. But sometimes they might have to come back and ask TCSS a question, consult with TEA. And so after those check-ins take place, your ESC leads will follow up with any of those supports that you guys requested. They really want to function as a technical assistance provider in this. And so if they need to reach out to another stakeholder, they'll make sure and follow up with those in-time supports. After that, we want you guys to dedicate time to review your submissions with the local advisory committee. So notice this is not at the front of the timeline. We do not expect local advisory committees to participate in the actual rating, but we do expect those committees to have access to the ratings that you guys submitted. Again, because we want there to be that level of transparency, and we know that we function in one scope or, tunnel vision of the work. We want parents and other stakeholders to have opportunities to contribute and to feel like their voice is heard and acted upon. And then lastly, when the FOI submission window closes, the data team is going to publish all of that data, which I think is a really sometimes unique and fantastic part of the way that our team has structured this FOI process. Again, we never want this to feel like you're answering 5,000 questions for the sake of checking a box and moving on. We want you to have access to what we are then seeing from a regional and a statewide level as well. So we will, within 1 month of that submission window closing, provide you guys with snapshots of data visualizations, again, of what we're seeing across the state as it pertains to each of those performance measures. Okay. Some quality assurance pieces of this as we kind of get to the end of our time. This tool is standardized across all awardees. Everybody has access to the same FOI toolkit and the same submission survey. And this is what's going to allow us to track district trends over time, as well as get that regional and statewide scope. And so when we think about participation in this tool, it is definitely mandatory for our awardees. If you do have additional local methods of program evaluation, you're welcome to use that in conjunction with this FOI tool. Please keep in mind that that could be an additional administrative burden for the people that are implementing and conducting the project evaluation. But that's up to you if you have that additional eval that you want to implement when you're thinking about those performance measures and thinking about grant progress and deliverables. Another thing to keep in mind, and we've touched on this before, I'll elaborate here. If an awardee rates a 3 or a 4, if you think back to that submission survey, if I click on the 3 or click on the 4 radio button, it's automatically going to pop up with a checkbox where I am certifying that, yes, we have artifacts that can back up our 3 and our 4. Your ESC regional lead is not regulatory. They're not going to be asking you to submit those, but it is a great way to show off the work that you're doing. It's a great way to facilitate more in-depth conversation when you're having those check-ins. And when TEA does pop in, we might ask to see some of those artifacts. We give you examples. It is nothing beyond what you guys would already be keeping when you think about grant implementation. So again, it doesn't serve as a gotcha. We just want to know what you're doing, how you're backing it up, and then we want to be able to take those ideas and go tell the other 97 districts who might be struggling in one of those performance measures. So just keep that in mind. And then again, that data turnaround piece, this is, again, the most exciting part of this. TEA and the TCSS believe that data collection should be purposeful. So we guarantee to produce meaningful metrics and data visualizations that you guys can reflect on post each quarterly check-in. Now, of course, what we're presenting to you after this very first quarter is probably not going to be as robust as a year from now when we can actually see some trends and growth and that sort of thing. But again, within 1 month of that submission window closing, we are going to happily report some of the trends that we're seeing regionally and statewide as well. Okay. Resources. A PDF of the FOI toolkit will be published to the Stronger Connections webpage. You can Google TEA Stronger Connections, and I promise it'll pop up. We all know that our website can be a bit tricky to navigate, but it is there for you. Again, we'll post that this week. The toolkit has that FAQ section embedded inside of it. Anytime we amend the toolkit or update the FAQ, we'll make sure that updated version, that date, is posted on the website. And we'll also make sure that we're highlighting and dating any of those changes within the toolkit. We will also make sure that the edited version, that essentially there's like a hard stop for when we can make edits, because what we don't want to happen is an evaluation window opens and we've got these districts using this FOI toolkit and these districts using this FOI toolkit. That's not to say that we anticipate the content of the rubric ever changing very, very drastically. But we just want to keep it uniform so that, again, there's some efficacy in the data that we're presenting to you guys. This webinar is being recorded, posted to that same webpage, as well as the slide deck. As we create and curate additional resources to help with the FOI implementation, we'll figure out the best way to release it to you guys. I think as we start having these check-ins and we start meeting with districts, we're going to have tons of opportunities to spotlight the work that you guys are doing as it pertains to the FOI. And so TEA wants to make sure that, you know, if District A or District B has found a really unique or great way to, you know, support the use of the FOI, a way that we can improve it, that we're making that available to you guys. And then on that same note, you are each other's biggest asset. And so please reach out to other awardees in your area. There are a couple of ESCs who have only between 1 and 3-ish awardees. So if you feel like you're at a standstill, if you feel like you need help from another district who's implementing the same work as you, let your ESC rep know so that they can outsource to other districts that are nearby, or thank God for Zoom in the virtual space. They might be across the state, but we want to make sure that you guys have access to each other as well, so that it's not just, you know, this network of, we do this locally, give it to our ESC, give it to the Texas Center for Student Supports, give it to TEA. We want you guys to have, you know, just points of this grant cycle where you're working alongside each other as well. Okay, so timeline and next steps. This first go around, we have given a lot of flexibility with when we expect districts to evaluate, when the submission window for that survey will open, when you can expect to meet with your ESC leads, because we want you to have as much time as reasonably possible to start checking some of these items off and having those conversations. So March 18th through April 5th is when we would expect you guys to meet internally, rate using that FOI toolkit, and submit that survey. The deadline to submit the FOI survey in Smartsheets is April 12th. Again, if you, March 18th, boom, bam, you've submitted your ratings, reach out to your ESC and have that additional flexibility to maybe meet earlier if you know that the beginning of April is a heavy time for you guys, or vice versa. If you need to take way to the end of the submission window, and then use the end of the ESC check-in window, there's a lot of freedom in that. April 1st through the 19th is generally when we would expect regional ESCs to reach out and schedule those virtual check-ins. And then April, May is when you'll discuss your submissions with your local advisory committees, depending on when you've submitted and depending on when your committee meets. And then April, May is also when we will publish our first FOI dashboard, analyze those metrics, and provide you guys with data visuals so that you can see what's going on statewide. So what does that mean, like right here and now, as far as action items are concerned? Schedule your first rubric rating meeting with your teams. We recognize that this is a busy time of year. Hopefully when we previewed this process back in November, it was on everybody's radar. But make sure that there is a time and space for campus, district, and business office leadership to come together, download that toolkit, and get your first rating done. So put that on your calendars. Go ahead and download and review that toolkit. Remember, it'll be available by the end of this week so that you can review it as needed, look at that criteria a little bit more intimately, and be familiar with it going into that meeting. Just remember, again, heads up, there are those budget related questions. If you have not already made a school year 24-25 proposed budget, quarterly budget, then you know during this first meeting that would probably be a great use of your time. And then I put some FAQs here related to action items that came from our first webinar. We don't have a NOGA. Are we completing the first FOI? Yes. This was a planning phase semester. There are a lot of things that districts have been doing, that districts have been thinking about as it relates to the planning phase, and we want to hear from you, and we want to document that planning phase experience. So the majority of you do not have your NOGA yet, but everybody is expected to complete that first quarterly FOI. What should we expect in the first ESC check-in meeting? Relationship building, right? Like getting to know your ESC lead, considering you'll be working with them for the next 2.5 years. Probably discussing your SMART goal so that your ESC knows what you're working towards. And then I would say the biggest kind of touch point for as far as rubric criteria is concerned, talking about your anticipated budget, talking about whether or not you're going to partner with a third-party vendor, talking about the formation of your local advisory committees, and then really just talking about expectations for late spring and summer when we think about, you know, training that might be scheduled soon, hiring of staff like project directors, counselors, mental health providers, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's kind of like a preview, a gist of what you might expect to talk about this first quarterly check-in with your ESC lead. Okay, I know we're almost at time. Hank and Carol, any like hard-hitting, prevalent questions that we need to touch base on in the next 2 or 3 minutes?
We do have one question that came in. Somebody asked if they submit their survey and then after they've submitted it, realize that they made a mistake, can they go back and make changes to fix their survey?
Sure. Yeah, so you will not receive a unique link to that survey. So once I'll answer it in 2 parts. If you get to the middle of it and then life happens and you never submit it, it's not going to have kept any of that information. So you'll need to go back and start from the beginning, which is why we prompt you at that beginning of the survey. Make sure that you have about 20 minutes to fill it out and make sure you have your rubric ratings in front of you. Vice versa, if you get to the end, you submit it, and then you're like, oh man, I made a mistake. You don't have a unique link, so you can't update it, but we can on the back end pull it, delete it, let you resubmit again as long as you're within that window. So for example, the deadline is April 12th. If you submitted it April 10th, made a mistake, you've got a couple extra days to tweak it as needed. Just reach out to your ESC lead who can get in touch with me. Or you're welcome to reach out to me directly and I can respond very quickly and get you what you need to resubmit. What else? That's a great question. I'll put that in the FAQ. Okay.
That is it. There are no
well,
other questions here.
Okay, I know that was a lot of information. I would love nothing more than for you guys to fill out a quick exit ticket. And I will put that link in the chat. It is literally just 3 questions. It has to do with the objectives that we discussed at the beginning of this presentation. We want to make sure that you have an understanding of the performance measures, that you have an understanding of that check-in process, and that you have an understanding of your immediate next steps. And if you're telling us, nope, I'm still a little lost, then we want to be able to take this survey and provide the follow-up support so that you guys know exactly what's happening submit that exit ticket, you are welcome to jump. We really, really appreciate your time. Oh, it says it's not accepting responses. Let me change that. Oops. Okay, you should be good now. If you'll refresh that, you should be good. Thank you to whoever caught that. And I'll put it in the chat one more time. This thing will go away. Okay, there's the link again if you missed it up top. Thanks, Diana. I think that it's working now. And I see some responses coming in, so I appreciate that. Again, just in case, all these resources will be posted to TEA Stronger Connections webpage. I see some people hopping off. So thank you guys for your time. Hank, Carol, any other last minute questions in there we should address, or you think we're good?
I think we're good with the questions. I just really appreciate the time that all of you have given today to learn more about this FOI process. This is really important work that we're doing in schools, and we really appreciate everything that you're doing to support students across Texas.